We did it! I still can't believe we got this project done so fast and so well.
When I'm in New York.
I'm in Chicago.
And I'm in LA.
But
we're making it happen in Miro.
Together.
Our best work just happens faster on Miro's collaborative online whiteboard. No more scheduling meeting after meeting for work that could happen
from anywhere. Whether it's getting design feedback here,
mapping timelines here,
or brainstorming next steps here. It all just happens on the Miro board.
Exactly. And it's nice not having to wait an entire day to get sign-off from this guy.
Hey! Well, it is true.
See how Miro users save up to 80 hours every year by meeting less and doing more. Get on board at Miro.com. The first 3 boards are free, forever. That's MIRO.com.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 361, interview with Edward Aldrich about his book, The Partnership, George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and the extraordinary collaboration that won World War II. Ted Aldrich, an international banker, has turned his love, nay obsession, of history into his first book. 7 years in the making, this book shows the efficient and effective team of Stimson and Marshall working together at their best when their nation needed them the most. Mr. Aldrich, thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been listening to your show for years, and I'm thrilled that I have a chance to speak on it.
Absolutely. All you had to do was write a book. That's not that hard. Just,
it took 10 years, but it was worth it to get on this podcast.
That's all you got to do is write a book. Or you could have sent a sizable donation, but I'm glad you chose the book route. So you've probably heard this before, or if you have not, as you go on and do many, many interviews, you will hear this time and time again. I want to guarantee you that right now. As I'm going through your book, and it might seem obvious now to you in hindsight, but as your book twists together the lives of Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, and General George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, that kind of book was very much needed because it reflects the reality that they actually did work together for 5 years, incredible partnership that we're going to go into. But there's another reason I'm glad you wrote this, because up until I read your book, I really don't feel that I appreciated Stimson's contributions as much as I should have. So as you put in the book, if you mention World War II, if you mention the American effort, you're going to get to the name George Marshall pretty darn quick. Maybe not Stimson, but you are here to help rectify that. And he was an incredible man. He was incredible physically. He was incredible intellectually, morally. I mean, he was the total package. It's just that I think he gets lost somewhere along the way. So given all of that, how did you come to write this book and include Stimson as much as you included Marshall in it?
Well, I agree with everything you say, Ray, but I would disagree to say while Marshall's name comes up, it certainly doesn't come up enough for my sake.
Right.
You know, he's more known for the Marshall Plan.
Exactly.
But this was his greatest feat. But in terms of why I wrote the book, I've a longtime history buff. I've been reading it since I was a child. And I've always moved around between eras and countries and types of history pretty randomly. Right. And for me, like you and your listeners, the World War II era has always been pretty compelling. And I regularly go back to it from time to time, probably more than most eras. But as you know, when it comes to books on war, publishers do tend to steer us, or I don't know, maybe we steer them, to books on those people in command of troops, you know, the men on the white horse waving the sword, so to speak.
The uniform and the, yeah.
Or in the case, not necessarily the horse or the tank, in the case of Patton.
Right.
Or those who are in charge of it as heads of their respective countries. So, you know, over the years, I've read books on the big three, as well as de Gaulle and Mussolini and Hitler. And in terms of the soldiers, you know, Eisenhower and Patton and Bradley, MacArthur and Curtis LeMay and Monty and Rommel and Zhukov from Russia, and even lesser known figures such as terrible Terry Allen. I'm sure you've covered in one of your podcasts, or Teddy Roosevelt Jr.
Right. Amazing man.
Yeah. So always fun to read. But during the course of all these years, always was dancing around Stimson and Marshall's name. They always came up at some point, but never as a team.
Right.
And obviously always part of someone else's story. So read about Marshall enough times, so I finally bought a book on his 25 years ago. And I was just in awe of his achievements. Still wasn't thinking about writing a book, and didn't even think about bother to read one on Stimson. But then I jumped from World War II and I got into a Cold War era and started reading books on guys like John McCloy, Robert Lovett, Jim Forrestal, Averell Harriman, Dean Acheson, Ike himself, the Bundy brothers. And I found that era really interesting. And what I found was that many of these guys were proteges of Stimson, or worshiped him to some degree or another, or certainly followed his interventionist policies. And a few of the authors of these books said things that made me pause. Kai Bird, a well-known author who wrote a book on John McCloy and the Bundy brothers, wrote that Stimson, I think he said, he cast a longer shadow over the 20th century than any other figure, period.
Wow.
Think about that statement.
Right.
And Eisenhower himself, when he was asked later in life who the greatest American he ever met, he replied, George Marshall, with Henry Stimson a close second. I mean, this is Eisenhower. He met a lot of pretty great people. So after that, I went out and got a book on Stimson, and equally impressive. And then it kind of hit me. Been reading about all these other guys, and I love the Pattons and the Eisenhowers and the Bradleys. Don't get me wrong, but I'm thinking to myself, who provided these men with their troops? Who organized the training of their troops? Who housed these troops, fed them, educated them, entertained them? Who presided over the contracting and the design, production, testing, distribution of the weapons and supplies they used, and the countless spare parts, and who came up with the strategy and military strategy and overall plans? So, and then when I started to think about the relationship between these two and how highly contrasting it was, I thought, I got a book here. And that's really how I got into it.
That's amazing. Now, I'm glad you brought that last part up, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but you did a lot of your research and or writing on your commute to and from work. Now, based on your research, that Marshall and Stimson would have approved of that, because they did not believe in wasting time at all.
That's true. Very efficient men. Yes, I live in Connecticut, and I worked in Manhattan for many years in the finance industry. It's about a 75-minute train ride.
Wow.
And I spent a lot of time on airplanes within the U.S. I worked for Japanese banks, so I a couple times a year I'd go over there. So it wasn't conventional. But what really helped was I had Stimson's diary. Really the major primary source, because these two guys had offices right next to each other, they saw each other physically, either in one or the other office or between them, where the door was always famously left open. The 10,000 pages and 4,000 during World War II, that described their relationship. Stimson wrote down every night, basically who he talked to, what he talked about, and his feelings. And so when I read that, mainly on the train, the whole relationship unfolded.
That's amazing. I need to get a copy of that, because, again, until I read your book, I wasn't up on Stimson as much as I should have. The man was a dynamo in every sense of the word, but we'll get to that in just a second. So I think it's July of 1940 when Stimson comes on board. Marshall's already the chief of staff. And these two men, like you said, they're going to see each other practically every day, or at least Monday through Friday, working together. Even though they end up working together, they start out very differently in life, in very different socioeconomic circles. I was hoping you could give us a brief bio of their earlier lives, and then we can take it from there to get them to Washington.
Sure. I spend about a third of the book on their biographies. So let's start with Stimson, who was, by the way, 13 years older than Marshall.
Right.
Wealthy New York family, educated at Phillips at Andover, one of the premier, most elite private schools in the country, Yale, where he was skull and bones, Harvard Law School, number 2 in his class.
Wow.
He got a job working for Elihu Root, former secretary, or at that point, no, but later a Secretary of War and Secretary of State under Roosevelt and Taft. And he became one of the top lawyers in the country. In 1906, Teddy Roosevelt, who was a friend of it, asked him to be U.S. Attorney to the Southern District of New York. And this is a big deal because Roosevelt wanted to take on the big trusts.
Right.
And a huge job. And he crushed that assignment. And he immediately became, he became an important guy.
Right.
And with Roosevelt's strong backing. And he really was a Teddy Roosevelt type guy. Although, you probably saw the photographs in the book, he looks like an accountant. He was really into the strenuous life almost as much as Roosevelt. And there's a great story when he was U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He and Elihu Root were, Roosevelt and Elihu Root, some January day were riding horses and in Rock Creek Park in Washington. And they saw Stimson on the other side of the creek. And this is January. The river's pretty much just frozen, icy water.
Right.
And Roosevelt just kind of facetiously says to Stimson, "Hey, why don't you come over, cross the river and come see us?" And Stimson hesitated, and then Elihu Root basically says, "Hey, the president just ordered you, Colonel Stimson, to to get to the other side." So Stimson basically plunges into the frozen water, falls off the horse. He and the horse submerge. He's going downstream in frozen water, couldn't even get to the other side, manages to come back up on the side he left, rides his horse, and now his clothes are freezing, about 150, 200 yards down, crosses a bridge, and then rides right back up to Roosevelt, a very surprised Roosevelt and Root standing there and saying, Stimson reporting to duty. And, they love to have that, physical challenges to one another. So he spends the rest of his life going back and forth between being one of the top lawyers in the country and public service. He unsuccessfully ran for governor of New York at Roosevelt's request, and then Taft named him Secretary of War in 1911.
Right.
And to give you a sense of his career, when he was named Secretary of War in 1911, the U.S. was still fighting Native Americans.
Right.
And we had one airplane. And when he retired in 1945 after his second stint, we were in the nuclear age. So it gives you a sense of how long his career was. So he became a Republican troubleshooter for Coolidge. He ended a civil war in Nicaragua in 1927. Then he was Governor General of the Philippines. And then Hoover named him Secretary of State during his administration. And then he was always known for integrity and bipartisanship. He was someone who, after he was Secretary of War, his stint ended. He spent a lot of time with the incoming Secretary of War for the Wilson administration.
Yes.
And he did the same thing after he left the State Department. FDR had him come to Hyde Park, and he basically sat there for, half a day explaining the state of the world. So Roosevelt remembered this. And during the late 30s, when Churchill was the only one in Europe making noise about Hitler, Stimson was doing the same thing in the U.S. He really thought this guy was bad news, and we should get involved. And of course, FDR was a huge interventionist, but publicly couldn't be. So after Paris fell in June 1940, he named him Secretary of War. So that's kind of Stimson.
Yeah.
Marshall, quite different. Small town guy, Uniontown, Pennsylvania, local schools there, and then he went to Virginia Military Institute, joined the Army at the turn of the century, and, an Army during peacetime during that period. Basically, you're moving every 2 to 3 years from one remote fort to another.
Right.
Pretty boring stuff. But what was unique about Marshall, every single stop he made, like Stimson, but in a different profession, he was beyond excellent. His record was stunning.
Yes.
He was considered like the best student in the Army, the best teacher in the Army, and the best staff officer. And of course, this does not serve people well. When you're known to be a great staff officer, you're not going to get the promotions. And war typically gives great opportunities, but it was this very excellence that ironically kind of was his undoing, because during World War I, he served on General Pershing's staff. So a lot of people after the war got promotions, and he didn't. And there's an interesting story about how it came to be that he got to know Pershing.
Right.
That's worth telling. It It was during World War One. He was helping to train the 1st Division. He and his boss and a few others, and Pershing came to visit. They went through the exercises, and Pershing asked the general in charge, what he thought of it. And before the general even spoke, Pershing just dressed him down, started criticizing, yelling and screaming at him. And Marshall stood up and said, "Hey, General Pershing, I don't think what you're saying is fair." And Pershing started to walk away, and Marshall, a young Marshall, this is in 1918, grabbed his arm and said, "Hold on, General. There's something to be said here, and I've got to say it." And he proceeded in what he later called an inspired moment to basically spend 5 to 10 minutes explaining all the problems they were having and how they were trying to solve them. And Pershing walked away, with a grunt, but he turned to his aide right away and said, "I want to keep in touch with this guy, Marshall."
Right. I'm pissed, but I respect what he just did. Yeah. Because no one touches or yells at Pershing. Come on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he ended up working for Pershing and performed brilliantly. And his big claim to fame during World War I was he was a logistics wizard. And when the Americans were, before the big Allied offensive, Pershing wanted to fight in the San Michel Bulge. And to do that, it required a tremendous movement in order to keep with the French and English schedule, tremendous movement of 400,000 men. 90,000 mules and horses, 40,000 tons of equipment, and 3,000 artillery pieces. And they had to move 60 miles within 10 days. Marshall planned the whole thing and pulled it off. And he had an amazing reputation, but no promotion along with it.
Right.
And he's so impressed. One of the guys on Pershing's staff was a partner at J.P. Morgan named Dwight Morrow, who happened to be the father-in-law of Charles Lindbergh. Mm-hmm. But Morrow offered Marshall a position at J.P. Morgan right after World War I, paying $30,000 a year, which was a fortune back then. It would have made him a wealthy man. Right. But he turned it down. He felt duty-bound to stay with the Army, thought his future was the Army. And he served as Pershing's chief of staff for 5 years after World War I. And then he went back to the grind of one fort after the other. Yeah. During the Depression, he commanded a few of the CCC programs for Roosevelt, the Civilian Conservation Construction, I can't remember what the acronym is, but doing all the
public works.
Yeah. And he got the attention of the administration because he did it better than anyone else. And at some point, Harry Hopkins, who was Roosevelt's right-hand man, was told that Marshall was the guy to speak to when it came to find out, what level of preparedness the U.S. was as things got heated up in Germany, and he really impressed. Hopkins, and Hopkins mentioned that to Roosevelt, and he got appointed chief of staff on by sheer coincidence, the very day World War II started when Germany invaded Poland.
Wow. And we certainly were going to need someone like Marshall. So before we go on, let me just give you a couple of impressions I got when I finished the book. One, Stimson is, at least on paper, I don't know, you tell me, he's a Republican. He grows up in a certain circle, and so that's what you do. Two, and I know you know this because you work in the private sector, never become indispensable. Because if you do, you're not going anywhere. And that's what happened to Marshall. Here's Stimson taking all these different positions and posts, and he's just getting more accolades, and he's getting smarter, and he's getting more experience. But Marshall kind of gets pigeonholed because he's so good at organization. But he does want to lead troops. He does want to get out there and fight. But what got me about Stimson was, and this is probably going to sound cliche or trite, here's someone who grew up affluent, only got more richer. That's probably not the correct way to say that. He got more money as he goes along, and one of the things that he constantly wants to do, he wants to do good. He wants to turn order from chaos. He wants to help people. I mean, he just wants things to be well done and for everybody to be respected. I mean, this guy, he owned himself. He didn't have to do any of these things. He could have just been a lawyer, made a ton of money, vacationed in Europe every year. He's got 4 or 5 houses. He wanted to make a difference. And so did Marshall. Marshall just wanted to do it in the Army.
That's absolutely true. It started at a young age. There's a letter he wrote his father, like when he was sent off to Phillips at Andover at the age of like 13. He basically said he's just trying to spend his time to find out which, find out the difference between the good boys and the bad boys. And it continued at Yale. Yale
Right.
had a real public service characteristic to it at that time in the late 1800s, and and Skull and Bones was all about community service, and he always wanted to not just do good things but also be involved in big things. So he was driven by it. Yeah, not driven by wealth at all, although he did get wealthy.
Yeah.
And Marshall was just, I don't know, the word has a negative connotation, but he was just a freak when it came to the concept of duty to his country. I mean, it was, during peacetime, being in the Army can be difficult. Most people spend their time hunting, playing sports, drinking, chasing the wives of other officers.
Right.
Marshall would be studying plans. Always looking to better himself. When he went to the Philippines for one assignment, he bought all the battle plans for the war in the Philippines, the Spanish-American War. And he was just constantly a student of war, assuming that it was his duty to assume that war was going to come and we had to be prepared. He was just extraordinary that way.
That's incredible. Yeah, I'm trying to remember Marshall. He hardly ever had to have notes. He had incredible memory. He out of all the things that he read, when he gave speeches, he was like, here's everything you need to know in the shortest amount of time that I can possibly tell you, because I don't like to waste the time. Let's make good decisions quickly and let's move on from there. That was Marshall in a nutshell. And he wanted other people to learn that ability as well.
He taught it. There's an anecdote when he was doing a lot of the teaching at the Army War College, and he was trying to shorten presentations from 45 minutes to 15 to 20 minutes, and the students were complaining, and he basically responded by giving the entire story of the Civil War, from the strategy, both the North and South, and the whole conflict in 5 minutes. And,
Succinct.
Yeah. And there's another story when Hap Arnold first met him, who was of course on the Joint Chiefs of Staff with him and head of the Army Air Force.
Right.
It was in the Philippines. They were both young men, and he saw Marshall giving orders without notes, lying on his back, perfect orders, very succinct, very brief. And he told his wife later, that guy's going to be Chief of Staff one day. So he was all about keeping things simple.
Right. Here's a question for you. What would you do to save humanity? And how far would you go to stop someone who is getting in your way? The ancient rivalry of assassins and Templars cuts to the heart of good versus evil. But it wasn't always clear who was good and who was evil. Plug in to explore the amazing world of medieval feuds. Echoes of History, Assassins versus Templars, is a special collaboration between History Hit and Ubisoft, the masterminds behind the Assassin's Creed games. Hosted by Dan Snow from History Hit and Matt Lewis from Gone Medieval, together they will take a close look at the real history of the secret societies, which inspired the Assassin's Brotherhood and the Templar Order in the Assassin's Creed games. Plus, they will bring on other premier historians as they discuss unearthing the myths of the Grail and who really was the inspiration for the main characters in the game. Echoes of History, Assassins vs. Templars podcast is available right now wherever you get your podcasts. Listen and subscribe to Echoes of History today to discover the hidden truths that have shaped our world and inspired the video game series. That's Echoes of History wherever you get your podcasts. Listen today and subscribe for more. And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but my excitement for Marshall is starting to come out, so I apologize. He rarely asked for anybody to speak up on his behalf. I think he was pretty much either, I'm not sure, hesitant, reticent, but I think he knew at the same time that his reputation for excellence would do a lot for him. Other people were talking about him all the time, like you said earlier, but it's not like he went around and go, oh, hey, mention me to this person, mention me to the president. That's just not who he was.
He went to a fault. Drove Stimson crazy. And the biggest example, of course, is Commanded D-Day. Everyone knew it belonged to him.
Right.
And Roosevelt knew it belonged to him. It was his for the asking, and not even for the asking.
Yeah.
Roosevelt asked him, and Harry Hopkins, on behalf of Roosevelt, would regularly ask him, what do you think about the Commanded D-Day? And his stock answer was, whatever you think is best, Mr. President.
Wow.
And Roosevelt knew that there was nobody who could control MacArthur and who could control the British. He needed him in Washington. So Roosevelt's preference was not to send Marshall, but he also realized, as he said to Eisenhower one day, Roosevelt said to Eisenhower, he said, Ike, you and I know who the Army Chief of Staff was during the Civil War, but nobody else does. I don't want Harvey Halleck, George Marshall, to become the next Harvey Halleck.
Right.
But he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Roosevelt gave him one last chance, and he said, I'm not going to make that decision for you. And Roosevelt said, all right, I'm going to give it to Eisenhower. So, yeah, he went out of his way in never seeking favor.
That's amazing. So let's skip forward a little bit. So World War II finally comes, but Pearl Harbor hasn't happened yet. And obviously, General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, they've got to get the U.S. ready to not only protect the United States, but we've got to be ready for war. We've got to help any allies that we might have. And this is probably my favorite part of your book. Of course, with hindsight, we know this. They've got 17 months. By the time both men are in office, they've got 17 months before Pearl Harbor comes. And even with their combined talents, they're going to have to push themselves harder than they ever have before because America is not anywhere near ready to participate in a major war.
No, America was never ready for war. I mean, it just...
Good point.
They just, they never were, and they were very unprepared. When Marshall took over office, we were the 19th biggest army in the world. We had like 170,000 soldiers spread out among all these forts in the middle of nowhere, set up to, keep an eye on Native Americans. Germany, by contrast, at that point, had 5 to 6 million, and that's excluding the Air Force. You had, because of the seniority system, you had a bunch of officers who really were talented, who just managed to just rise through hanging on for years. You had old, decrepit barracks, weapons. We had the weapon of choice at that point was a Springfield rifle, which was predated the World War I. Right. We had 300 battle-worthy airplanes. Germany had 10 times that amount.
Yeah.
You recall from all your research and the various work you've done that we had no tanks. The Louisiana maneuvers, where Ike and Patton both kind of made their bones, they had to use trucks where they painted tank on the side of it.
Right.
And the Nazis at this time had nearly 3,000 tanks in the summer of 1940. So, but as you pointed out, ridiculous obstacles, the biggest one being time and isolationism. And time, when Stimson joined Marshall, France, Norway, Holland, Belgium had already fallen, and the day Stimson joined, officially took the oath of office, the Battle of Britain had started. And isolationism, the usual reasons. Typical American looked at a map and saw a huge Atlantic Ocean on the right, a huge Pacific Ocean on the left, a friendly Canada, and a non-threatening Mexico. And they said, we're good. We don't need to do anything else. And of course, there was a lack of appreciation for air power at that point.
Right.
A huge lack of appreciation for air power. So, and there were other obstacles. Americans in America, since the founding, have always been fearful of a powerful army. We were fearful of corporate monopolies. I mean, it was amazing how much struggle when Alcoa, or Ford could offer a big contract. A lot of the people in the Roosevelt administration would basically want to put a stop to it, saying, no, it's going to create a monopoly. And, you contrast that with Hitler. I mean, I doubt he was too bent out of shape if VW or Messerschmitt or Krupp got orders that were too big.
Right.
And another huge obstacle was just general complacency. Marshall went around before the war giving so many speeches explaining to people that during the Revolutionary War, we had 10 times as many soldiers as the British. 10 times. And in the War of 1812, we had 30 times as many soldiers.
Wow.
And he explained the reason we barely won was because these guys were trained and we weren't. And even World War I, people don't appreciate that America didn't start fighting until nearly 4 years after the war had started. It was kind of like going into a boxing match, after two guys had beat each other for 15 rounds, going in the 14th round and then jumping up and down when you won.
Right.
Americans basically thought it was going to be easy. So that's why it took them that 17 months. They were struggling to convince people that we had to get prepared. But a lot of the isolationists really believed that that by being prepared was actually almost guaranteeing you were going to fight.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we prepare for war, we're that much closer to war. When marshals say, no, we've got to be ready at the very least to defend ourselves. And I'm taking this from your book. He said, by the time you develop a weapon, you're going to need at least 18 months before it can be in the field. And if we work really hard, maybe we can get that down to 12, but it just takes time. You can't go into something like this and go, okay, now we're going to gear up for war. They've got to be ready. And he pushed that message every single day.
He did, and prior to Stimson joining him, without much success. No, it's not
Right.
not because of him, just because it was a war that really a lot of people just didn't think after World War I, they didn't think they needed to get involved in another European war. And
Right.
I always think to myself, if I were living back then, I fear that I might have had that same attitude.
Yeah.
It's just like, yeah, come on, Europe's getting another war. They've been fighting for 1,000 years. Why do we need to get involved?
Right.
So,
Yeah. Well, plus
but
you want to believe that because it's safer that way. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it was people like Stimson. I mean, Stimson, because of his job as a corporate lawyer, where he was advising the top corporations in the country, and his public service, where he was on conferences and he got to know intimately the economic potential of all these other countries. He knew that the world was connected by trade, and that isolationism was not something you could do, because if Hitler got too much power, he could really hurt the interests of the U.S.
Yeah.
Whereas people who aren't involved like that, or in the middle of the country where you don't have access to the ports where trade is coming in, you have a different attitude, and
Right.
it's not a shock that the Midwest was the place where isolationism was strongest.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what's amazing is Pearl Harbor ended that immediately.
Exactly. All of FDR's problems went away. Yeah, with Pearl Harbor. The one thing you reminded me of is 2 points on Stimson. One, he said, look, you've got to let business make a profit if they're going to produce war goods. Let's just keep an eye that it's not too much of a profit. That's the nature of business. If you're going to shut that down, they're not going to want to help you. And if the actual workers in the factory aren't excited, you're not going to meet any quotas. I mean, he was a pragmatic realist, and FDR needed that. But my other part, the part that shocked me, Stimson, as far as I can tell, please tell me if I'm wrong, doesn't have a sense of humor, doesn't really do sarcasm. And there were a couple of times when he jumped FDR in the middle of a meeting, almost slapping the president down because he didn't feel like the president was taking this threat seriously enough. Or you make this point in your book, FDR liked to keep things confused and a little muddled so he can keep control, keep power, keep options. And here's Stimson going, I want hard and fast decisions now. You're getting in my way. You're frustrating me. And I think Stimson and Marshall, maybe secretly in their offices, put their heads together occasionally when FDR is driving me crazy.
Oh, his administrative style was an obstacle. I mean, he was a political genius, but he believed in putting like multiple people in responsible for the same thing, all for the sake of controlling power, controlling the situation. And it drove him crazy. Stimson would mention in his diary all the time. But they also knew that he had greatness. That's for sure.
Right. And if I could, again, I want to leave the meat of the book for the readers, because just well done. 560 pages of basically the American perspective of the war, certainly through their offices. But when Pearl Harbor comes, Marshall and Stimson have different reactions to this.
Yeah, so it was just such a pleasure reading the Stimson diary, and you'd come across nuggets occasionally. On December 7th, he was giddy. He was
Right.
he was so psyched that the indecision was over.
Yes.
And he knew from what I said a few minutes ago about how intimate the intimate knowledge he had with the corporate power and the industrial potential of America. He had because of his being a corporate lawyer. So he knew right away that the U.S. was going to outproduce all the other countries combined.
Right.
And that alone was going to win the war. He had no doubts. In fact, he and a few of these guys, the other cabinet members, just Hull, the Secretary of State, and Knox, the Secretary of Navy, these guys, it's amazing. And I know you've come across this in your other books, but they start planning for the post-war within 3 months of Pearl Harbor, when Japan and Germany are still running roughshod over us.
Right.
That's how much confidence they had.
Yeah.
Whereas Marshall was distraught. His wife wrote a book, wrote her memoirs, and basically said he came home ashen faced, and he was a real Southern gentleman, and he didn't even look at her. He just walked upstairs and said, "I'm going to bed." And that's because he didn't have that knowledge. That he just knew he had an unprepared army. So,
that was his focus.
Yeah. So it was an interesting contrast.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to give too much away for the readers, but the part before Pearl Harbor, when you go into what Marshall and Stimson have to work with, first of all, we got to talk to the isolationists. Then we've got to get more troops. And then we've got to house these troops. Then we've got to train them. We have to equip them. I mean, they literally are starting from scratch. And so that part of the book, it's almost like a montage of a movie where it goes really fast and you get all worked up. It's like I was just reading page after page and what they were dealing with. So let's go into why they were so effective. So by the time I finished reading this book, I feel like it almost makes you want to be a better person when you try to compare yourself to Stimson or Marshall. You're like, you know what? I need to raise my game. But these guys were brilliant. And I know this is not sexy, but, administration and logistics, that's not sexy. But the other part of it that's very effective but not sexy was that these two men were honest enough and smart enough with themselves to go, hey, there's some things I'm good at, there's some things I'm not good at. Let me surround myself with people who might even be smarter than me, or at least as smart as me and driven as I am. And that is how you get things done.
I mean, look, this is, I'd like to say, and I've said without, I think, being hyperbolic, that I think what they did was the greatest feat of management in the history of the world.
I agree.
But you can't do it by yourself. So these guys, I can't say enough about their ability to recruit, inspire, and manage men. And they had different styles in how they did it. Stimson's experience in 1906, when he was named U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, he was given a teeny budget that would basically cover one lawyer in New York.
Right.
And they had so many trusts to bust.
Yes.
And what he did was he basically went around to the top law schools and said, give me the names of your top number 1 and number 2 students over the last 3 years.
Right.
And he felt he could bring them in and for very small money and inspire them about the work they were doing and working for Teddy Roosevelt. And he got guys like Felix Frankfurter, who was one of the smartest guys that ever graduated from Harvard Law School, who later became Supreme Court Justice. And all these people that he hired early in his career went on to great things. And he went back to that well. And when it came to World War II, he had 5 core staff. And all 5 were graduated from Harvard Law School, and not just graduated from Harvard Law School, but One of them was number one in his class, Harvey Bundy. Another, Robert Patterson, was number two. Another, George Harrison, clerked for Oliver Wendell Holmes, which means he had to be in the top five.
Right.
And it sounds a little elitist that what he was doing is what he was doing, but it wasn't just their educational credentials. These guys had amazing careers. Robert Lovett was one of the great bankers of his time. John McCloy, one of the greatest negotiators of his time, and lawyers. And Bob Patterson was one of the top judges in the country. Harvey Bundy was one of the smartest guys ever to graduate from Yale, and he was a terrific lawyer. And George Harrison was head of the Federal Reserve. So he had a very diverse group of people that just happened to go to Harvard Law.
Right.
But it worked for them. And he also had a character test. It wasn't just smart people. And that was just as important to him. Now, Marshall had a different approach, and I alluded to his sense of duty before, but he had a habit from when he was a very young officer of keeping a little black book where he wrote the names down of people who impressed him.
Right.
So he met Eisenhower in like 1919 when they were both kind of assigned to work on Pershing's memoirs, and Eisenhower came in here and made a few suggestions, and Marshall said, well, I'm going to do it this way. And Eisenhower basically just said, well, no, I think it should be done this way, and gave a very articulate argument about why he should do it this way. And Marshall was impressed because he doesn't like yes men, and he wrote his name.
He got into the book.
Guy who is very candid and smart. Yeah. And Patton, on the other hand, his notation to Patton was kind of crazy guy, needs to be reined in, but he would do very well leading a tank division. And he kept all these names, and when he's finally named chief of staff, and he had no idea of knowing when he was keeping this little black book for so many years that there would be a war, or that he'd be in charge. But sure enough, it happened, and he just went to the black book, and he was almost flawless in placing men in right positions.
Right. And you bring up another interesting point. So it's a fine line. Marshall is intelligent, very driven, thinks about the future, but at the same, and in some ways he's very humble, even though he knows he's good at stuff, but he was ambitious. And I mean that in a good way. He wasn't, I just want to be in charge because I want to be in charge. I want to take everything that I've learned, and I want to be in a position where I can take or recreate the army that I love and make it better.
Correct.
Just absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Always pushing for that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you mentioned this earlier, but you were talking about the two offices side by side, the doors open so they could go in. Now, technically, Stimson, who is in his early 70s when World War II starts, he's Marshall's boss, because of the politician is over the soldier, and that's how it should be, especially in a democracy. And I think they had a little bit to do with that establishing. I'm trying to remember, civilian power over the military. There was something in your book. I can't remember it now, but so you have two men. There's no ego here. What is best? The door is open. We're both committed to memory, both committed to duty. And again, they just got along and worked effectively well together.
I mean, listen, that's literally what the book is about, the partnership, right? It was It was remarkable by any historical standard. And, in retrospect, it's like, of course they're going to work as a team because it's in the interest of the nation. But history points to too many different wars where, egos did get in the way. And even World War II, MacArthur, I mean, my gosh, if MacArthur had his way, I mean, he was a terrific general. But he wanted the whole war to be fought in the Pacific because that's where he was.
Exactly.
So,
it's about him. Yeah.
No, they did have this open door, and it was left deliberately open for a couple of reasons. One, pragmatic. Right. But also they wanted to send a message to all staffs of both men that there were no secrets between the civilian people within the War Department and the and the military guys. And they if you think about what they needed to do and did do, fighting two wars, opposite sides of the earth for the first time, had to deal with both land and air operations for the first time. Yeah. And think about, they added, I mentioned 170,000 soldiers. Within 2 years, they're up to 5.5 million. Wow. They built barracks for essentially, it's like building 250 towns for 5,000 people. They did that within 18 months.
Yeah.
And, they had to design, produce all these weapons, and it's not like you can just go to a catalog and order a weapon.
Right.
I mentioned the Springfield rifle, so they needed a new rifle.
Yeah.
And what goes into a rifle? You have so many factors: durability, precision, the weight. Most of the time you're going to be carrying it, right? 95% of the war you're going to be carrying. It has to be light.
Right.
It has to be easy to make. It has to have a fast rate of fire. It has to be easy to use. It has to be consistent, and it can't cost much. They had to factor all these things, and in a democracy, everyone was opining on this, from senators and congressmen, and NRA, and Roosevelt himself, and lobbyists, and they had to make the decisions, and their men had to make the decisions. The point is, they couldn't do it themselves. They needed this first-class staff, and they needed those staffs working together because, of course, the military guys want the perfect weapon, right? They want the perfect weapon. And if you had 10 years, you might be able to make the perfect rifle. Right. Whereas the civilian guys are like, hey, you know what? This war could start any month. Cost is a consideration. You take that from they ended up picking the Grand rifle. And it was a great choice. Patton said it was the greatest battle implement ever devised. So all this in strategy, there's no question they couldn't have done it without this incredible sense of teamwork. And it's not easy. I mean, they needed to be candid with each other. It's tough, but they felt they had no choice. There were more important things than letting their egos get in the way.
Absolutely, a sense of duty. Oh, you just reminded me of something. Remember earlier when you were saying sometimes FDR would tell one person one thing and he would tell somebody else something else, and maybe that was just FDR's way of keeping things at a distance or whatever. But these two guys would get together and go, "Well, what did the president tell you? Well, what did the president tell you?" And that way they could check him, which they had to do occasionally. And go, "Look, we haven't got time for these little word games of yours, Mr. President." But they had to check with each other to see what the latest hubbub was from the Oval Office.
They did, and they had a tag team approach to dealing with him that was very effective. Yeah, and Stimson would call him out. Yeah, as you alluded to sometimes, and and just even during a cabinet meeting, he'd call Roosevelt out because he was between the age of 73 and 78, and he had no future in politics. So,
good point.
Yeah,
good point. But that's true. Don't get me wrong. This is his last probably political job, wherever he's in his 70s. But at the same time, it is his sense of duty. He's like, this is what we need to do. This is the right thing. I don't care about anything else. This is the right thing to do. And he wore it on his sleeve. And he could ruffle some feathers, but he did not care. So we've got this incredible team set up. And again, I want to leave the bulk of what they achieved because that was just so fascinating and fun to read, but we can see the results of what they achieved on the battlefield. So we'll leave that for the reader. But I did want to give you an opportunity. Was there anything in particular that stands out to you during the war of what these men accomplished?
I mean, there are a million things. And
it's only 560 pages. Why are you making such a big deal out of it?
By the way, it started at 800 pages. I had to cut it back because the publisher said people don't read 800-page books anymore.
I would have. It was good. Go ahead.
It's how they managed everything. I mentioned we just talked about how they managed FDR, how they managed the British. They had, a big theme through the book is the British did not believe, they thought the war could be won without us going into Germany. They just thought bombing them and surrounding them would work. And Stimson and Marshall were like, nope, you need to invade France and go to Germany. And how they managed that during the cross-channel debate was incredible. And they had they did a lot of things, particularly Marshall, that I think were ahead of their time. For example, at one of the big conferences in the U.S., Marshall knew it was going to get pretty ugly.
Right.
And he arranged ahead of time a corporate offsite, if you will, where Colonial Williamsburg had just been finished, with Rockefeller money.
Right.
And he arranged for the 4 Joint Chiefs of Staff from the UK and the 4 from the US to spend 24 hours there, basically, where the rule was to not talk about the war at all, just to get to know each other, swim, look at birds, whatever your individual passions were. He and they went back to yelling at each other the next day, but it was little things like that that were just surprisingly impressive considering the era they lived in. How they managed their subordinates. Marshall believed strongly in making do with what you have. There was a story early on where before North Africa, Marshall sent Patton out to train troops in the desert in the U.S. for preparation for North Africa, and he gave him a division to do so. And within a few days, Patton, being an aggressive, ambitious guy, basically said, he needs another division. Marshall sent one of his staff over on a plane out west and basically to order Patton to get on a plane and head to California, and basically fired him. From this particular assignment. And then he wouldn't take his calls for a few days. And then Patton, getting the idea of what was going on, basically through an intermediary, basically said, well, I think I could really do this with one division. And then he sent him back to train the delegates. And I mean, how he managed MacArthur. He had every reason. MacArthur was a rival going back to the World War I days. And he helped prevent Marshall from getting a promotion. He one time moved him away from a very prestigious CCC command job to training troops in Illinois. Right. But Marshall's it was kind of like Lincoln with his team of rivals. Marshall said, this man is a great military strategist. We need him. So he just set aside all that stuff. And how he handled them was amazing. And Stimson, too. Stimson really believed in keeping big things for himself, and both guys were. There's two stories. One, Marshall's in a big meeting, and I think it's I can't remember the guy who interrupted him. Who was Eisenhower's chief of staff? Bedell Smith. Bedell Smith came in one day and said, "Look, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's this guy talking about this vehicle that's very durable." And Marshall just turned to him, trusting his subordinates, and said, "What do you think of it?" He goes, "I like it." He goes, "Then order them." And that led to the purchase of 650,000 Jeeps.
Incredible.
It's a very decisive. Yes, trust. And then reading Stimson's diary one day, I came across a single sentence basically saying, Stimson's writing among the things he did that day. He said, I also made the decision to build the Pentagon. The Pentagon remains the biggest office building still in the world, but he had bigger things. So it was just, so these guys were incredible that way. It was also incredible, I think, how they lifted each other up. There were times when Stimson was very frustrated, and you could see Marshall really helped him. And times Marshall was down, not just after Pearl Harbor, but there were other times. And both men believed that the other was indispensable, and made sure they looked out for each other during the entire war. Yeah. And I guess another thing is technology, particularly Stimson. Here he is, 78 years old when the war ended and when he retired, but he was one of the most forward-thinking guys in the administration when it came to technology. He was organizing all the scientists and bringing them into the administration. He was the one who was shouting that we needed to emulate the British in terms of radar. It was just incredible how an old guy, and usually old guys, would be the ones that would say, we're going to do it like we did it back in 2004.
I can't work the remote. So
exactly.
Yeah. Oh, before we go on, and did I cut you off? I'm sorry.
Well, the last thing,
yes, please.
We talked about it, is just it's now being repetitive, but their integrity and sense of duty. That was something that Churchill Marshall was the only general Churchill ever feared, apparently. And integrity in a democracy can be a really powerful thing. That's a theme that runs through my book. And all the British chiefs of staff who fought against Marshall, to a man, they all said he was 100% honest. And Stimson too.
Wow.
Every once in a while, a congressman would come and start screaming at Marshall over something, and Marshall would say, "I understand your point. Perhaps you should go talk to this Secretary Stimson about it." And of course, they never did, because he was like the rock no one wanted to stand up to.
Exactly. Oh, I'm trying to remember, was there a moment in your book when, I think this is early on, when FDR calls General Marshall by his first name, and the general gives him a look that FDR never did that again? Is that,
Yeah.
am I remembering that correctly?
So Marshall was almost Washingtonian, and he had this, he believed, starting when he was at the Virginia Military Institute, that he believed that to command respect, you couldn't get close with people.
Right.
So he started at a very young age, and he always insisted on keeping a distance between people and formality. And that included Roosevelt. And Roosevelt did one day, said, "George, what do you think of that?" And just, and everyone knows Marshall had a stare, and Roosevelt picked up on it immediately and never called him George again. So, yeah,
Right.
he was, I mean, it worked for him, but he strongly believed that he never went to Hyde Park.
Right.
He, and he never had drinks with Roosevelt. He just wanted to keep it professional.
He never voted, right?
No, he never did.
Because he that wasn't his place.
He felt that he wanted no part of politics,
Right.
and that wasn't an Army person wasn't supposed to be political.
And as far as the being distant from people, that wasn't an affectation. He thought he was being a more effective commander or supervisor by having a little distance between himself and his men. But he looked out for the morale. You give numerous examples of Marshall doing things to make sure that the men can relax and smile and that kind of thing.
His whole career, and Stimson too. I mean, Marshall's whole career was spent trying to figure out ways to build up morale. And Stimson also was ahead of his time. He had his whole law staff would come to his home in Long Island for days off. He had a work hard, play hard attitude.
Right.
So it was But you'd asked, were there other things? I really should point out, because this is going to come across to readers, as these guys were saints or perfect.
Sure.
They had their share of mistakes. I mean, Pearl Harbor was really, at the end of the day, on Marshall. The Japanese had managed to fool a lot of the Americans, including him, and it was his responsibility that Pearl Harbor was not on their list of places they were going to attack. So that was, I would say, his big mistake. And for Stimson, and I had to deal with an entire chapter with this, his big mistake was agreeing to send Japanese Americans to internment camps away from the West Coast. And, there was a hysteria around that. There were most of the Army wanted to do it. Every congressman and senator and governor on the West Coast wanted to do it.
Sure.
But it didn't need to be done.
Right.
And it was against his better judgment. He knew it was unconstitutional. He knew it wasn't a military necessity, but the pressure of those first few weeks after Pearl Harbor, he kind of failed himself there, and it was a black mark on his and Roosevelt's part, and frankly, a lot of them. I mean, the Supreme Court ended up supporting them in the first test of that, when one of the Japanese Americans sued. So it was a fault of the nation, but Stimson really had the stature and the integrity and the position where he could have done something about it and didn't.
Could have fought back, yeah.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, these guys are human. We have to remember that. And I want to stress this because I think we've mentioned it, but we haven't stressed it. These two gentlemen, way before it was popular, or whatever the correct word is, they had already worked out a philosophy of the work-life balance. They were very sincere and determined to make sure there was downtime. There was moments of levity for their men, maybe not for themselves, but for their men. And they really did, exercise, diet, get plenty of sleep, have an interest, have a hobby. And yes, you can come back to your work, but they wanted their men to have full lives.
It was less about that, and less about having fun or full lives than it was they believed the body was a machine that needed to be rested, that needed to not have stress, that needed exercise. They were well ahead of their time in terms of Marshall rode a horse every morning. Stimson would play this form of tennis every night. They were obsessed about exercise, sleep, and rest.
Yeah.
And it shocked me because, you picture them being kind of like these kings of the universe guys that are working 18, 19-hour days.
Right.
No. They would leave at 5 because they knew that they made the best decisions when they had a good night rest. And of course they had a staff doing a lot of that stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the other part of having a team. It's not all on you, because Stimson would go to one of his houses on the weekend, and I'm not sure about Marshall, but he certainly did ride horses and try to spend time with his wife on the weekend. So we're going to skip some more here, but so we're getting near the end of the book. And obviously, the way it kind of worked out for me, because this book is 560 pages, I would read a couple of chapters a day. And after about a week, this book, any book, becomes a part of your life. These two men become a part of my life. And so when you get near the end, yay, the war is over, but obviously these men are going to have to transition into something else. They've given everything for this, and it finally becomes, the Allies' victory. But as things start to wind down in your book, the tears come. Not their tears, my tears, because again, they had become a part of my life. Could you please tell us the story of Stimson's last day in office?
Yeah, that is a powerful story. It was his 78th birthday, and
Wow.
Truman finally agreed to let him go. He had a lot of post-atomic bomb work that Truman wanted him to work on, but he had a heart attack, I guess, in the closing days of the war. So he was ready to leave, and so he had a busy day, and he met with Marshall, and it was a very emotional meeting for both of them, and he met with his staff, and then he had to go to a cabinet meeting where he was trying to sell the concept of sharing Soviet secrets with the Russians, which wasn't very popular.
Oh, the nuclear secrets.
Yeah, the nuclear secrets.
Yeah.
And that was delayed. But meanwhile, Marshall basically had invited 125 generals, the biggest gathering of generals in the history of the country, to the tarmac where Stimson's plane was going to leave, along with Stimson's staff and an army band. And it was a hot day in September. And because Stimson was late, he had these generals lined up in 2 lines for over an hour in the hot sun. And when Stimson arrived, he was just overwhelmed with emotion as he walked down the line. And at the end of the line, at the base of the stairs, was Marshall. Took his hat off, nodded his head, and shook his hand, and said goodbye to him. And it was I think Marshall was sending a message to all the generals. I mean, here the U.S. Army was sitting in its best position ever.
Right.
And he wanted them to know, hey, we report to the civilians. It was a strong message. No matter how good we're feeling about ourselves, in the United States, we're subordinate to these guys.
Right.
And it was a wonderful story. And Stimson's 10,000-page diary ended with a sentence, and Mabel and I got on the plane and headed for Long Island. And he never wrote another word in his diary. It was after reading 10,000 pages of his diary, as you can imagine, I was a little emotional at that point as well.
Yes. He just stops. It just stops. So now let's do the same for, Waterworks. Let's do the same for Marshall. Please tell us the story of Marshall when he's at Queen Elizabeth's coronation in 1953.
So it was the last service he did for his country. Eisenhower asked him to represent the U.S. at the coronation of the Queen. I can't believe she's still alive.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. So he goes there with Omar Bradley, and he's getting old at this time. And it was at Westminster Abbey, and he's walking in with Bradley, and what Marshall notices when he walks in is immediately everyone on both sides of the aisle stood up. And as Marshall was walking forward, and Marshall leaned over to Bradley quietly and said, who are they standing for?
Right.
And Bradley looked at him kind of with a smile and said, it's you moron. And he didn't use those words exactly, but
right.
That was also just so characteristic of Marshall. He was truly a humble man. He did not know it was him that they were rising for. But his reputation at that point in the UK was unbelievable. And I just thought that was a great and funny story.
Right. Oh, no, chills. I'm getting it all over again. So I think, first of all, thank you for this book. Thank you for your time today. It was absolutely incredible. But if we could, because this is such an intense story, I was hoping we could end on a light note, and I'll just make this real quick. So
Sure.
You were mentioning earlier, again, there's 17 months before Pearl Harbor that these guys are working flat out. They got to make a billion decisions. Everything's interconnected, whatever. The stress is getting to George Marshall for all of his professionalism, for all of his balance work, everything. It's getting him, and Stimson can see it. Stimson can see it. And there's a letter or an order or whatever that Stimson puts together to try to help Marshall take some time off. And if I could, I'd just like to read it real quick. It's around page 193 in your book. And Stimson writes this, and it's for Marshall. The President of the United States directs that General George C. Marshall, during the period between Friday, October 11th and Monday, October 14th, shall visit the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, for the purpose of making a report on the comparative akin and valor of the football teams of Davidson and VMI, Virginia Military Institute. During said period, he shall be under the exclusive control and direction of Mrs. George C. Marshall, and shall be protected against all interruptions, particularly of members of the Department and of the Congress. During said period, the War Department shall be regulated to the tender mercies of the Secretary of War, the Assistant Secretary of War, and the Deputy Chief of Staff, General Brydon, by order of the Secretary of War. Again, Stimson did not have a sense of humor per se, but this is, I think, one of the most lighthearted moments of his life. I'm sure when George Marshall read this, he's like, okay, I give up, honey. Let's go see a football game.
Yeah. So you're right. That's probably the funniest thing that Stimson ever wrote down on paper.
Yeah.
But it was touching. Marshall was a little down at the time. I think he had a cold, and he was going to. Stimson got word that he was going to attend this thing with Stimson, and and when he heard that, he said, "No, this can't be. He's got to take a break."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. So, again, Ted, thank you very much for this book. The book, again, is The Partnership, George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and the Extraordinary Collaboration That Won World War II. I want to thank you for your time. And this is the highest compliment I can give a history book. I'm going through your book, and as you probably do yourself, oh, that's a good section. Let me highlight that. Oh, that's a good section. Let me highlight that. I ended up highlighting 3/4 of every page, and I'm like, okay, this is not going to work. This is going to be a 15-hour interview, and nobody wants to hear this voice for 15 hours. So no, but it was
nor this one,
right? But it was your first book, correct?
It is, yeah.
So well written, and like I said, you drop enough little stories in there that are related, but not directly about Stimson and about Marshall, and it just really pulled the picture together of America's war effort in the war. And I just want to thank you so much. Incredible book. It's out for sale. I encourage everyone to check it out. And again, Ted, thank you very much for your time today.
Ray, thank you so much. Love your show, and I'm very happy to be part of it.
Thank you, sir.